focus of all those documentaries and Hollywood movies. But there's one version of Titanic we have never seen until this morning.
For the first time, we have an exact digital copy of the real thing.
For more than a century, the Titanic has been frozen in our imagination as a single moment, a ship splitting the night sky with its lights, then sliding beneath black water. We thought we knew the shape of that story. We were wrong. Buried under 2.5 miles of freezing Atlantic water, a team of engineers, historians, and deep-sea specialists has spent years building something no one had ever attempted, an exact, full-scale digital copy of the wreck, rivet by rivet, deck by deck. What they found inside that data didn't just add detail to the Titanic legend. It rewrote parts of it. The story of this discovery doesn't begin with a diver or a headline. It begins with two remote-operated robots, nicknamed Romeo and Juliet, sinking slowly through total darkness toward a wreck that has rested on the seabed since 1912. The company behind them, a deep-sea mapping firm working with a documentary production team, had a goal that sounded almost impossible: scan every square inch of the Titanic and the debris field around it, then stitch that data into a single, seamless, one-to-one digital replica. For 3 weeks, the two submersibles moved across the wreck site in careful, overlapping passes. They weren't allowed to touch anything. The wreck is a grave site as much as an artifact, so every image had to be captured from a distance, using multiple cameras and laser scanners working in tandem. By the end of the expedition, the team had collected more than 700,000 high-resolution photographs and hours of 4K footage, adding up to roughly 16 terabytes of raw data. To put that in perspective, someone on a project compared it to the equivalent of 1.5 million songs worth of information, all of it describing a single object resting nearly 4,000 meters below the surface. Turning that mountain of images into something usable took months of rendering and processing. Engineers used a technique called photogrammetry, essentially teaching software to recognize the same physical point in thousands of overlapping photos and calculate its exact position in three-dimensional space. Point by point, the wreck reassembled itself on a screen, not a blurry composite, not a stitched-together mosaic like the ones explorers had produced in past decades, but coherent, walkable, life-size model. For the first time, researchers could step back and see the entire ship at once: the still upright bow, the shattered stern 600 meters away, and the long corridor of debris connecting them. Previous expeditions to the Titanic had always suffered from the same limitation. Submersible lights only illuminate a small patch of wreck at a time, so every past photograph or video clip showed a fragment, a porthole here, a boiler there, without ever revealing how those fragments related to each other. This new digital twin solved that problem completely. Researchers could finally place every object in context: which room a teacup came to rest near, how far a boot had traveled from the passenger cabins, what condition a railing was in relative to the deck it once stood on. It turned an underwater junkyard into something closer to a crime scene map, with every piece of evidence located precisely in three-dimensional space. The first full view of the digital twin startled even the specialists who had spent careers studying the Titanic. The bow section, still recognizably ship-shaped, sits upright in the mud, its railings bent forward as though the vessel were still straining toward New York Harbor. The stern, in brutal contrast, is a collapsed ruin, decks pancaked on top of each other, machinery torn loose and scattered, the hull twisted into shapes that no longer resemble a ship at all. That contrast has puzzled researchers for decades, but the scan finally let engineers run detailed structural simulations against the wreck's actual geometry instead of guesswork. What emerged was a clearer picture of how differently the two halves died. The bow, heavy with flooded compartments, sank in a relatively controlled, nose-first descent, burying itself into the seabed almost gently by comparison. The stern, however, was still full of trapped air when it separated from the rest of the ship. That air turned it into something like an out-of-control glider, spinning, twisting, and flooding unevenly as it fell, until it slammed into the ocean floor with enough force to crush multiple decks into one another. Between these two ruins lies a debris field roughly 5 miles long and 3 miles wide, scattered with everything from coal and dinnerware to shoes, suitcases, and personal effects. Historians working with the scan have been able to match specific objects to specific passengers and crew members, turning an anonymous debris trail into a map of individual human stories. A pair of boots resting together on the silt, for instance, marks the spot where a body once came to rest, long since consumed by the deep sea's chemistry, leaving only leather and bone-adjacent traces behind. One of the digital twin's most significant contributions has been settling a 100-year argument about exactly how the Titanic came apart. Survivors in the lifeboats gave conflicting accounts on the night of the sinking. Some swore they saw the ship snap cleanly in two before it vanished, while others insisted it went down in one piece. For decades, historians leaned toward dismissing the "it broke apart" testimony as panic-driven exaggeration, since the wreck's condition on the seafloor made a clean, simple split hard to picture. The scan ended that debate. By reconstructing the fracture points across the hull in exact detail, engineers could trace how the ship's midsection didn't fail all at once, but progressively: steel plates buckling, deck supports giving way in sequence, the superstructure twisting under stress it was never designed to bear. Rather than a single dramatic snap, the wreck shows the signature of what structural engineers call a progressive failure: one component failing, transferring its load onto the next, which then fails in turn, cascading through the ship's frame over a span of minutes rather than seconds. This matters because it validates a group of survivors whose accounts had been quietly sidelined by history. Passengers on Titanic's stern watched the ship visibly tear itself apart before the final plunge, and for 100 years their memories were treated as understandable but inaccurate trauma responses. The data now says otherwise. The digital twin doesn't just describe metal fatigue. It restores credibility to the people who lived through it and were, for a century, quietly doubted. Titanic was designed with a safety margin that was considered remarkable for its era: 16 watertight compartments, engineered so the ship could stay afloat even if 4 of them flooded completely. It was a genuine engineering achievement, and it's part of why the ship earned its reputation for being nearly unsinkable. The scan reveals, in forensic detail, exactly why that margin wasn't enough. Rather than a single gaping gash torn open by the iceberg, the image most people carry from films and illustrations, the true damage was a series of narrow openings along roughly 300 feet of the starboard hull, some barely wider than a sheet of paper. It wasn't one wound, it was 6. And 6 was one more compartment than the ship's design could survive. That distinction matters enormously to naval engineers. A single massive breach would have been, in a strange way, more survivable, concentrating the flooding and giving crews a clearer emergency to respond to. Instead, water crept in simultaneously through several long, thin slits, spreading the flooding across compartment after compartment faster than pumps or bulkheads could contain it. The Titanic wasn't sunk by brute force. It was sunk by precision, a narrow, almost surgical pattern of damage that happened to defeat the ship's safety design by exactly one compartment. Of everything the digital twin has revealed, nothing has resonated more than what it uncovered in the boiler rooms. For over a century, the Titanic story has largely been told from the decks, the band playing on, the scramble for lifeboats, officers trying to hold back panic. What happened far below the waterline, in the ship's engineering heart, was mostly left to speculation. The scan changed that. On the deck of the wrecked stern section, researchers identified a steam valve, frozen in the open position. To understand why that single detail matters, you have to understand what the valve controlled. It fed steam from the boiler rooms to the emergency dynamos, the generators that kept Titanic's lights burning and her pumps running. An open valve meant one thing: someone had to be down in boiler room 2, shoveling coal and managing pressure, long after the order to evacuate had been given. Survivor testimony had always insisted the ship's lights stayed on almost until the very end, a detail some historians treated as a comforting embellishment rather than a literal fact. The valve proves it was an embellishment. Maritime experts who studied the scan concluded that the engineering crew, estimated at around 35 men, remained at their posts in the boiler room for more than 2 hours after the iceberg strike, well past the point when they must have known the ship was doomed and evacuation for them was no longer realistic. What they bought with that time was light. Not symbolic light, literal electrical power, keeping lamps burning on the boat deck so crews could see to load lifeboats, keeping the wireless room powered so operators could keep transmitting distress calls into the night. Every extra minute of electricity was a minute more for lifeboats to be found, filled, and lowered safely instead of in pitch darkness. Historians reviewing this evidence now describe the boiler room crew's decision to stay as one of the quiet acts of collective heroism that never made it into headlines dominated by wealthy passengers and dramatic rescues. Their names rarely appear in popular retellings of the disaster. The scan is, in a very real sense, giving them their record back. The digital twin didn't just vindicate anonymous crew members. It corrected one of the most persistent and unfair accusations leveled against a named individual, First Officer William McMaster Murdoch. For decades, popular culture treated Murdoch as a symbol of panic and cowardice, an officer who allegedly abandoned his post, or worse, in the ship's final minutes, an image cemented for millions of people by a dramatized and widely criticized scene in a famous 1997 film. Titanic historians had long argued the portrayal was unfair, built more on secondhand rumor than solid evidence, but without a way to physically examine the wreck in detail, the accusation was difficult to definitively refute. The scan gave researchers exactly that ability. By examining the precise position of a lifeboat davit, the crane-like arm used to lower boats into the water, on Murdoch's side of the ship, engineers found it positioned in a way consistent with an officer actively preparing to launch a boat, not one preparing to flee. That physical evidence lines up with a survivor account from Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who maintained that Murdoch was swept overboard by a wave while still working to get a boat away, rather than abandoning his crew. A century-old accusation, repeated in countless retellings, may finally be corrected by a piece of twisted metal photographed from every angle nearly 4,000 meters underwater. The scan is also forced a rethink of what happened to the ship's midsection during the final plunge. Popular imagination pictures the Titanic breaking neatly into two large pieces, bow and stern, each sinking as a relatively intact unit. The wreck tells a more violent story. Mapping the debris field in detail, researchers traced hull fragments and internal structural pieces scattered across a wide radius, evidence that the midsection wasn't simply severed. It was torn apart with tremendous force, ripping directly through areas that had been some of the most luxurious spaces on the ship. Some of the wealthiest, most prominent passengers on board were last seen in or near those very areas as the ship's final moments unfolded, adding a grim specificity to what had previously been treated as a comparatively cleaner part of the disaster. This detail also helps explain a mystery that had puzzled marine archaeologists since the wreck was first located in 1985, why entire sections of the midship seemed to be simply missing from the debris field. If the structure was violently torn rather than neatly separated, portions of the frame may have disintegrated entirely under the stress or been thrown far enough to remain unmapped even after this expedition's exhaustive survey. Some of Titanic's story, it turns out, may still be scattered across sediment researchers haven't reached yet. Beyond the two headline discoveries, the boiler room valve and Murdoch's davit, the scan is quietly confirming or correcting dozens of smaller survivor accounts that historians had never been able to verify. A shattered porthole along the ship's side, for example, supports passenger recollections that ice and freezing water burst directly into cabins as the hull scraped past the iceberg, rather than merely leaking in through a slow structural breach. Elsewhere, the exact positions of collapsed corridors and stairwells are helping researchers reconstruct where crowds likely gathered and how quickly different sections of the ship became impassable as flooding progressed. None of this rewrites the broad outline of the disaster, the iceberg, the flooding, the desperate scramble for too few lifeboats, but it fills in the texture of those final hours with a level of physical evidence that pure survivor testimony, however sincere, could never fully provide on its own. Titanic analysts who've spent years working exclusively from written testimony and blurry archival photographs describe this scan as something closer to finally being handed the crime scene itself, rather than only witness statements about it. For the first time, they can check memory against metal. For all its precision, the digital twin hasn't answered every question, and in some cases, it's sharpened new ones. The missing sections of the midship remain a genuine mystery. Researchers still debate whether they disintegrated completely on impact or lie buried under sediment thick enough to hide them from even this level of scanning detail. There's also an unresolved irony sitting at the center of the ship's own design. Titanic's double-hull bottom and 16 watertight compartments were, for 1912, remarkable safety innovations, part of what earned her the reputation of being nearly unsinkable. Yet those very same design choices may have shaped how catastrophically she failed once her safety margin was exceeded, concentrating stress in ways her builders never modeled or anticipated. It's a sobering reminder that engineering designed to prevent one kind of disaster can sometimes create the conditions for a different one. Among the smaller, quieter discoveries buried in the scan data is the wreckage of Titanic's Marconi room, where wireless operators sent the distress calls that ultimately brought rescue ships to the survivors in the lifeboats. The room itself is barely recognizable now. Collapsed equipment, corroded wiring, a tangle of components that once carried some of the most urgent radio traffic in maritime history. But its position in the digital model lines up precisely with where the ship's power was being routed from the boiler room below, physically connecting two of the disaster's most important storylines: the engineers who kept the electricity flowing and the operators who used that electricity to call for help until the signal finally died. That connection matters more than it might first appear. Wireless technology was still relatively new to passenger shipping in 1912, and its role in Titanic's rescue was one of the first times the world saw radio prove itself as a life-saving tool rather than a novelty. Every additional minute, the boiler crew kept power running below decks with a minute the wireless operators could keep transmitting above them. The scan doesn't just document two separate acts of dedication happening in different parts of the ship, it shows how directly they depended on one another. Without the fires kept lit in Boiler Room 2, the distress calls that reached the nearest rescue ship may never have gone out at all. It's easy to think of the objects scattered across the seabed, shoes, dinnerware, luggage, personal trinkets, as background texture to the main story. Researchers working with the scan treat them very differently. Because the digital twin maps the exact location of thousands of individual artifacts relative to the ship and to each other, the debris field functions less like a shipwreck and more like an archaeological site, one where position tells a story almost as clearly as the object itself does. A pair of boots resting close together, for instance, typically marks a spot where a person came to rest on the ocean floor, since footwear survives the deep sea's chemistry far longer than anything organic does. Clusters of first-class luggage, still roughly grouped together despite over a century of currents, suggest where certain cabins or corridors gave way as the ship broke apart. Even something as mundane as a scattering of coal can help researchers trace which bunkers ruptured and in what sequence, adding another data point to the timeline of the ship's final hour. None of these individual artifacts rewrites the broader history of the disaster on their own. But together, mapped with this level of precision for the first time, they let historians move from a general narrative, the ship sank, people died, belongings scattered, to something closer to a minute-by-minute reconstruction of where people were, what they were carrying, and how far different sections of the ship traveled before finally settling into the silence of the seabed. More than a century after Titanic went down, it remains, in the words of one analyst who studied the new scan, the last surviving eyewitness to its own disaster. What's changed isn't the ship, it's our ability to finally listen to it properly. Every rivet, every twisted beam, every personal item scattered across the seabed carries information that photographs and sonar alone could never fully extract. The digital twin has already reshaped several long-standing narratives. It has restored credibility to survivors once quietly disbelieved, corrected a century-old slur against a dead officer who couldn't defend himself, and finally documented an act of collective sacrifice by working-class crew members whose names never made the front pages in 1912. And researchers are clear that this is only the beginning. The dataset is large enough and detailed enough that specialists expect to spend years running new analyses, testing new theories, and likely uncovering findings that haven't even been asked about yet. The Titanic story was never really finished. It was simply waiting in the dark, nearly 4,000 meters down, for someone to finally see it whole. What makes this moment different from every previous Titanic rediscovery is scale. Robert Ballard's original 1985 photographs gave the world its first proof that the wreck existed and roughly where it lay. Decades of subsequent dives added fragments, a clearer image of a boiler here, a better angle on the bow rail there, but always piecemeal, always limited by the small cone of light a submersible could carry into that darkness. The digital twin is different in kind, not just in degree. It compresses years of expeditions' worth of visual information into a single, continuous, explorable model that specialists can now revisit indefinitely, running new questions against the same dataset without ever risking another expedition to the seafloor. That's arguably the quieter, more important legacy of this project. Physical access to the wreck will always be rare, expensive, and risky, a reality made painfully clear by the loss of a submersible attempting to visit the site in 2023. The digital twin offers something the wreck itself never could: repeatable, low-risk access for researchers anywhere in the world. A metallurgist studying corrosion patterns doesn't need a research vessel and a 6-week weather window. A historian trying to verify a survivor's account doesn't need funding for a submersible dive. They need the model, and the model isn't going anywhere. It also means the Titanic story is no longer entirely dependent on future dives finding new fragments by chance. Much of what remains to be learned may already be sitting inside the 16 terabytes of data collected in that one expedition, waiting for the right question to be asked of it. Researchers have described going back to the model years after the initial scan and noticing details missed on the first pass: a bent fitting, a scorch mark, an object half buried in silt that suddenly matters once cross-referenced against a survivor's testimony. In that sense, the digital twin isn't a finished product. It's an archive that keeps yielding new answers the longer people are willing to look. So when we say this discovery changes everything we thought we knew, it isn't a slogan. It's a genuinely accurate description of what happens when a 100-year-old mystery, built almost entirely on scattered photographs and fading human memory, is suddenly handed a complete, precise, three-dimensional record of the physical evidence. Survivors who were doubted have been vindicated. An officer wrongly blamed for cowardice has had his reputation quietly corrected by the position of a lifeboat crane. 35 anonymous men who chose to stay below decks in the dark, in freezing water, doing a job that offered them no chance of survival, have finally had their sacrifice documented in the language engineers understand best: steel, wiring, and the simple, stubborn position of an open valve. The Titanic went down in under 3 hours on a cold April night in 1912. It has taken more than 100 years and one extraordinary feat of modern engineering to finally understand what those 3 hours actually cost, and who paid the price for every extra minute of light.